Good afternoon, everyone. Well, thank you for joining me here. Well done for finding your way over from Moscone. You've passed the first test. I'm sure it feels like it's been a long day already, particularly for those of you like me who have come from slightly further east, as you can probably tell by the accent. So my name's Max Coppin. I'm based in our London office. I work in where a lot of our Android enterprise efforts are based. Just to give you a bit of background, I've had, counting it up, about 15 years of experience in various different mobile technology companies, various different roles, so a developer through to admin, various different sort of experiences of different technologies, back from the days when mobile email was exciting, push email was yet to be a thing, which now seems like a very, very long time ago and makes me feel very old indeed. But I'm going to take you through the strategies around Android and Chrome, how you can use some of these technologies, hopefully to improve your enterprise experience. Just a quick look at the agenda. So we're going to look at some research and some analysis from some of the kind of leading companies in this space. A bit about strategy development, selecting and deploying the tools, some examples of where some of our partners have kind of really embraced this, and then last but by no means least, some of the resources that we have to help you go and replicate this in your organisation. So we've got some research from our friends at CCS Insight, who I'm sure some of you are familiar with, that we're going to use here. So really, we're looking at the kind of the maturity levels of organisations, and there's this kind of real spread from some very kind of basic, if you like, sort of elementary levels of deployment, right through to, as hopefully you can see, some of the more advanced technologies and really kind of transformational type solutions that companies are looking to put out there. So what we see really is that there's a big kind of step change between these, or there can be a big step change between these different steps, these different stages. And there are a few kind of points that we'll call out that really kind of aid that. So this center of excellence you can see in the middle is something that often gets pointed at as a way in which you can really help move organizations through these different stages. And we'll come on to some numbers that back that up in a minute. But really the idea of giving employees a sort of place to go to get help in terms of deploying a mobile solution and that kind of thing. The other area that we hear of as kind of particularly key and very kind of important going forward is the idea of when you're getting to high levels of maturity, of really kind of measuring that success, and not just measuring adoption. We deployed application X to whatever percentage of employees, but the real kind of business impact of that, how that actually changed the business, saved time, that kind of thing. And the other interesting sort of insight that we see quite a lot is there's a pretty clear kind of alignment between a company success and their actual kind of maturity level here. So there really is kind of a lot of proof around business success and mobility maturity. So if we take a look at some more research around these kind of apps that are typically used, the first column shows really these kind of more common sort of collaboration apps. I think there's a bit of a question mark really as to whether these are going to be the sort of IT deployed, corporately managed applications, or whether they're more sort of guerrilla IT or whatever you want to call it, but sort of consumerization of IT type deployments where employees are kind of using the apps maybe in a kind of unsanctioned way. But then as we kind of move through, we get to these kind of occasional, typically it's kind of like, seems to be sort of approvals or like emergency access type applications. And really, it's only the kind of single-digit percentages in the kind of rare section, which is where hopefully everyone's trying to get to, but is the particularly kind of small number of applications being adopted there. So those are the really kind of line of business, more kind of transformational applications that have been deployed. But there's another kind of question that we'll come on to a bit later, which is really around the sort of relationship between IT and the employee in terms of like who's driving the adoption, who's making the decisions, who holds the budget, all things that are kind of, I guess, points of friction and potentially contention. So a few other numbers to run through around this. So average number of apps used by employees for work is apparently 4.1. I don't know what that 0.1 of an app is, but there you go. But apparently 86% of employees say that they do use or do regularly use applications at work, but it's just the 4.1 is the average number of different apps that they're using. Now that number is obviously something that we predict, or certainly Gartner predict, to increase hugely over the years. There is one stat that I've heard, or one prediction that I've heard that sounds rather scary, is that they talked about the idea of the average company producing 1,400 new apps by 2024, which sounds like a kind of extraordinary number, a kind of scary number, a bit of an extreme number. Getting on for like, whatever it is, around 200 a year, and it will be 5 times more than IT can cope with in terms of demand. So great news. Isn't that just what you wanted to hear on a Wednesday afternoon? But it's an extraordinary number, given that in, I think it's 2016, Aperion did a survey where they said that 80% of the organizations that they work with only have less than 10 applications deployed. So there's this huge kind of curve coming, and a whole load of sort of challenges and complexities associated with that. Quite where all these applications are going to get written, and who's going to do all that developing is another good question. Although, if anyone has a kid, anyone got kids under 3? Stick your hand in the air. Just me. There we go, a few there. Have you ever heard of the Fisher-Price Coder Pillar? Be scared, be very scared. It's a coding a toy aimed to teach kids from 3 years on to code. So very scary. I'm sure my daughter will be looking forward to that. So a huge uptake in applications, and a huge uptake in the increase in the kind of speed at which these applications are going to be developed, which is another kind of challenge when you look at the typical enterprise deployments or development cycles are sort of 18 to 24 months, whereas now you're seeing sort of requirements where you're looking at sort of weeks and even days in terms of deployment cycles. So again, Gartner's sort of prediction is to look at this kind of bimodal approach, where you kind of say we're going to have some applications that are typically more like legacy, long-standing applications that we're going to develop with one methodology, and then we're going to go more agile for something that maybe is tied to a specific event or has a sort of finite lifetime and a completely different set of requirements. So 41% of employees say mobile's already changed the way they work. That kind of makes me think it's possibly a little bit low, but something that, again, those previous numbers suggest that it's going to change pretty drastically over the coming years. And this is something that maybe backs up that previous number and where the change is going to come from. So 76% of employees have not asked their IT department to provide apps for work. So why do you think that is? 75% of them said they would not ask IT because IT would say no or ignore their request. So quite a simple answer, but quite a challenging one. When you think, if IT are kind of seen as blocking, then what typically happens is obviously employees kind of go around IT and find their own way of doing things. It's the scenario of, I want to be able to annotate that PDF. You're not giving me the tools to do it, so I'll forward it to my personal mail, and then I'll go and do it on my personal device or whatever it is, and suddenly you're kind of out of that kind of sphere of control. So there's good reasons for kind of trying to help employees through these challenges. And so the lack of a formal process for requesting applications is really seems to be the big challenge. Really at least having a way of allowing employees to request apps helps kind of shape your demand and what, in terms of type of applications, in terms of volumes, and helps you really kind of segment users and all these kind of best practices around determining what it is that you need to start providing to your employees. Anything where you're getting numbers to back up decisions is always going to be a good thing. So 72% of employees do not have a company app store. So I think here there's a lot of sort of user behavior and so on from the kind of consumer world, where you have an application to do just about anything, and you go to your store, you search for whatever it is, whatever hotel you're in, or airline, or city, and you type in whatever it is, and you'll find an application for it. And that's typically how users find applications. If you don't have that set up within your organization, then how are users going to find the application? And I think what we've certainly seen from the Google side historically is that the first thing that an enterprise would try and do would be to block access to Google Play and distribute apps their own way. And I'll come on to a little bit later about how we can negate the need to do that and deliver a much better application experience. So when we look at the sort of market and the types of applications out there, I think as we've seen, there's the bulk of applications are really the kind of packaged, off-the-shelf SaaS. I'm extending some existing application. It may be collaboration or that kind of thing. Moving up through those steps, it's this existing, maybe approval, mobilization, desktop process, et cetera. The top is where we really kind of aspire to get to, and where I think the most benefit can be had. And these are typically applications that are maybe sort of mobile first or even mobile only, where you're really kind of taking advantage of what the power of the device to deliver a very kind of different, unique, and again transformational experience. So with that in mind, there's one bit of information that never seems to change around sort of importance in terms of spend, and security is always up there. Mobility always seems to go hand in hand with security. It opens up arguably a number of other. I'm certainly used to open up a number of other sort of attack vectors and this kind of thing. And I think I'd like to think that things have moved on slightly from where we were a few years ago, and that security used to be very much a blocker in mobility, and that we could not deploy devices, applications, whatever, because there is no kind of secure way of doing it. I'd like to think we've kind of got beyond that now, in that there is a way of doing it. There may be sort of regulatory or other kind of reasons around that, or that adds the complexity to it. But I think really that we don't really see, based on sort of conversations that we have with customers, security actually stopping the deployment. I think a lot of the reason that security is a priority going forward is around some of the new legislation coming in. So things like GDPR, which hopefully you're familiar with. If not, go and Google it. There you go, plug for our search friends. But go and have a look at that, and that has some pretty strict requirements around reporting of data breaches and this kind of thing, which are going to drive some changes in sort of security and mobility usage patterns. So there's a number of different analyst firms and reports have talked about how Android's kind of rise in the enterprise world is going to really change things going forward, in terms of not just replacing sort of typical knowledge worker, black breed deployments, but also in the kind of these real kind of different use cases and line of business, purpose-built, rugged, etc. type deployments. So some of you might have seen my colleagues presenting on this kind of thing earlier, but that's where there's a huge, I guess, area of opportunity to tick off a lot of those boxes in terms of big ticket, really important enterprise sort of changing application deployments. So not just what was I doing at the desk, now I don't need to do it at the desk. Really kind of going beyond that. And there's a whole slew of kind of, like it says, future requirements, these kind of newer technologies that I guess are not immediately things that are thought of as enterprise technologies, but things like voice and assistance and so on, where if you're looking at a device that is going to be operated by someone with gloves in extreme conditions and so on, they're not going to be able to necessarily use even a keyboard, let alone a touch screen. And so embracing kind of technologies like kind of voice control and so on can really help there. And there's a huge range of Android devices out there, which I'm sure for a lot of you was historically seen as a bit of a challenge and a bit of a problem. And the F word always used to come up, fragmentation, nothing more extreme than that, before I get bleeped on the video. But that's something that, again, we'll talk about in a minute, how we've hopefully solved and kind of flattened out that landscape for you and made it really easy to deploy a range of different funny shaped devices across the organization for completely different use cases. So in terms of strategy development, there's could go on forever really with a list of kind of things to consider here. What is the aim and why are you doing this, and who are we doing it for, are things that may sound straightforward and silly questions, but I think they often get kind of ignored because it's easy to kind of skip too far down the line and sort of go, right, what's our IT strategy? Well, we already kind of know where we want to get to, and let's just kind of work back from there. And where we want to get to, maybe something a bit more basic around, maybe deploying MDM or whatever. But really, by going through these questions and looking at what we're trying to do, I think is a really kind of key way of doing it. The other interesting thing we always hear is around what stage companies think they're at. So hands up here who would say they've got an IT strategy. Anyone confident enough to say that they've got one, or even a written down one? I mean, that's the other thing that we really don't see much of, is kind of people documenting and iterating on that document. Period of time that needs to cover is another interesting one. I mean, typically, businesses may have a sort of 1-year strategy, and an IT strategy is going to be over 3 to 5 years. Aligning business and IT strategy are pretty key, but not necessarily achieved, particularly with kind of staff turnover and so on. Another good reason for documenting these things. And measuring results and iterating. So, like I say, measuring the success and the change that you're having, not just the adoption. So, my favourite examples of what's not a strategy, I think, which are all scenarios that I've had personal experience of. The days of BlackBerry panic, where everyone had to kind of throw a BlackBerry into all of their kind of senior employees' hands because the law firm next door was doing it. It's not really a strategy. It's very much a sort of reactionary tactic to try and often get a bit of appeasement. I need to get the CEO's iPad working. Was another famous, I think there was one Christmas where it seemed like every CEO, CIO, etc. went home, got an iPad, threw it at IT, who then went, oh God, what are we going to do with this and how are we going to get this working? And that generally kind of moved into the sort of bottom state of, I need to be able to lock, locate, wipe all these devices. And then that kind of challenge of personal devices moving into enterprise world, the whole scenario of whole device wipe, and that kind of led into containers and that kind of thing. And I genuinely have had a conversation with a company who were that kind of one company who seemed to be the one who were being sort of taken to court by someone because they wiped their device and it had pictures of their cat on. So it really does happen. It's not just that kind of example that people trying to sell you a container solution talk about. So a few other considerations on this side. So engage line of business. So I'd say think outside of the IT department and get out there and work with these line of business. There's one company that we've been doing some work with where an airline who are looking at what they can do around working with their employees, and they've gone to the extent of a number of their IT staff have trained as cabin crew, so they can go out and experience what the cabin crew experience and better understand the kind of challenges that they're going through. So that might be quite an extreme example, but it's a very good example of kind of living the business problem rather than kind of working it through in the confines of the IT department. And often kind of working with with business and this phrase of citizen developers, which I'm sure you've heard of. All these kids who grew up with their Fisher-Price Caterpillar and move into companies and start writing applications to solve business problems. You've got to, going back to those numbers that we saw earlier, it's really that scenario of if there isn't a kind of an application supplied to me to solve that problem, I'll go and write my own. And if I don't have a good way of requesting that from IT and so on. So if someone's motivated enough to kind of write an application and solve a problem themselves, then that's someone that you really should be kind of working with. Survey data, again, kind of key. So not just the feedback form, how did you find this device, was this application useful, but you can go a level deeper and look at the actual kind of analytics within applications. What are people doing? If you're deploying an application, what are they doing within the application? Which screens are they spending their time on? What are the kind of actual actions that they're going through? And it's very easy using a number of our tools and others to collect that data and do the analytics there. And avoiding these what we call like top drawer deployments, where they go, great, thank you IT for giving me this wonderful tool. I'm going to stick it in the top drawer because you've turned this wonderful smartphone into essentially the internet connected paperweight, and it's now no use to me. So again, some kind of basic sounding things, but often somewhat overlooked. What are the outcomes going to be? So we should have a tool that's really going to help our employees do a better job. It does raise a whole other set of questions around who chooses the tool, who's responsible, who pays for it, and often these are decisions that are kind of more led by sort of regional variations, legislation, and so on. But there's a whole bunch of reasons that we'll come on to how you could work through these challenges. So, a little bit on tool selection. So, we've got a whole bunch of Google devices running a couple of different OSs or a few different OSs up there that are essentially, as one of my colleagues always calls them, or at least he did until the wearables came around, glowing rectangles. So you kind of choose your glowing rectangle. You leverage the power of the cloud, which we've heard so much about this morning, and our various different services there, in order to deploy whatever application it is that you're trying to deploy and solve whatever problem you're trying to solve. So if we drill down into what that means in terms of Android and Chrome world, we've got a whole range of devices to cover, every kind of price point, use case, from these kind of convertible tablets to rugged devices that you can drive over and so on. So if we look at what that means in the Android world, I mentioned earlier the F word and what we've done to try and improve that challenge that we kind of gave to you guys historically. And I think that the main message now is that if you go out and acquire an Android device, as long as it has GMS, the Google Mobile Services, on there, then it will have all of the enterprise capabilities that you'll need baked into the platform. So that's the work that we've been doing, fully integrating this into the platform, and enabling a number of our ecosystem partners to really kind of leverage that technology. So starting with Lollipop, we introduced this framework, introduced this into the framework around the support for sort of device owner and a separate managed work profile on the device. And that was really kind of the core of what was introduced into the framework. With Marshmallow, we introduced some APIs, what we call COSU, So it's corporate-owned, single-use deployment. So really a kind of rugged line of business kiosk device. Call it what you will. Choose your own acronym. But a device that is going to be really aimed for a sort of single purpose and only running sort of one or two applications. And then we stepped through to N, and obviously we'll continue on to O, just adding really incremental features and improving a lot around the user experience on that sort of things. Now, alongside that, we've done a lot of work on Google Play. So I mentioned earlier how the first thing that a lot of IT companies a lot of IT departments would do would be to sort of block Play, take it off devices somehow, disable it, and deploy applications another way. Well, some of you may have caught Adrian's talk earlier, but Play is actually a very powerful tool for enterprise security now. So one of the key things that we're trying to avoid companies having to do is enable unknown sources on their devices. So this idea of sort of sideloading applications that don't come from Play. And the reason for that is because any of the applications that go through Play go through a huge amount of scanning that is increasingly leveraging our machine learning capabilities and so on and so forth to ensure that these applications are trusted, secure applications. So we support a number of other features in terms of things like bulk purchase and managed configuration. So this idea of rather than presenting a user with an application which they then need to enter, a username and a server address and a port and a whole load of config info, which they're either going to get wrong and sort of drive support calls or not do and therefore not use the app. We now have a consistent way of ISVs allowing their applications to be configured across the board by an EMM. So all of these features are essentially leveraged by whichever EMM is that you use, be that G Suite or be it one of the many partners that we have. The other thing I should mention at this point is that there's no requirement necessarily for your application to be public. So another kind of common bit of feedback that we got was we have an application that we're going to deploy internally to our however many thousand devices, and that's kind of the only application that we want, or these 10 applications are the only ones we want. Why would we look at using something like Play? And so we've given you a way of providing not just managed Google Play and saying, I want to provide a subset of the public applications in Play, but you're also able to publish on through a private channel your own internal applications, again through the same kind of familiar user experience. So from a user perspective, I'm going into my Play Store and I'm searching for an application, and it's there. It's just that you as IT know that it's already been sort of approved and deployed accordingly. And what these kind of two Android platform features and the managed Google Play are really trying to help you guys do is move sort of through these steps and through the kind of maturity curve that we looked at earlier from the kind of traditional knowledge worker sort of email and collaboration tool really down to this far end where it's devices on forklift trucks in really kind of rugged, very much out of the office scenarios. So we have a solution for the knowledge worker. We have this device owner concept where you can manage the whole device. So very much kind of traditional MDM. We have this BYOD for millennials with wacky haircuts, where you can have a separate managed profile on a personal device. And again, all the sort of usual boxes ticked in terms of IT, just having visibility into this managed profile and nothing beyond, and no one having their cat pictures wiped. This single use, like I said, COSU as we call it, API set, where I'm really kind of locking the device down into a specific application or set of applications. And then really beyond that, it's kind of down to the sort of limited only by the imagination of yourselves and the OEMs to produce a device that will meet those requirements. So I mentioned the OEMs there as some of our key partners on the far left. I mean, this is a subset of our ever-growing list of partners. But this gives you an idea of the kind of ecosystem that we're operating with. So device manufacturers are obviously key. We need them to be shipping Android and the later and greater versions of Android, much like the carriers and the kind of approvals that we go through with those guys. EMM, MDM, MAM, call it what you will, partners are also really kind of leveraging all of those features that are baked into Android. So that's the key takeaway for those guys, is that the features are in the platform, and it's the EMM who leverages them. And then obviously ISVs are critical to the deployment through Play and VPN in a similar sort of fashion, and an SI to pull it all together. So if we move on to the Chrome side, hopefully you're all familiar, at least in passing, with Chromebooks. And what sort of changed relatively, or in the last 3 years, was this move from really a kind of low price point device into a few really kind of enterprise grade, higher end models. And there's a few here, the ThinkPad, the Dell device, and the HP device are all kind of tick that box. But really, again, there's a story beyond the kind of desktop for Chrome, in these kind of going from knowledge workers on the far left to signage, particularly as we get into more exciting things where we're getting into digital signage that is dynamically changing based on a whole load of kind of cloud-based analytics or whatever it may be. Kiosks again. Another little route rather than the Android route could be Chrome kiosks, and Chromebox for meetings as well. So something that we use hugely internally is the Chrome as a video conferencing platform. So again, similar to Android in that you can deploy in a range of different use cases. And Chrome's strength is really, like I say, speed, security, and simplicity. We've had huge success in the education space because of these features. Really, it's very easy to get up and running quickly with a hugely sort of well-managed set of devices. And again, you've got this kind of consistent management experience across different OEM platforms. So a quick look at what you can do management-wise. There are kind of user settings, which, as you may expect, follow the user on different devices. Device settings are for that specific device and often sort of inherited from the user settings. On the public session settings, this is really for if you want your kind of Chrome kiosk, that kind of thing. And then there's the devices sort of asset tracking management, who's logged into devices, where and when, and looking at usage and so on. So on the user side of things, what we see most usage around is apps and extensions, customizing the web store. Route through a proxy is a very widely used sort of non-VPN way of getting enterprise connectivity, and right down to kind of hardware management, such as webcams in this slightly bizarre looking example. Now, to kind of give you more options or confuse you somewhat, depending on the way you look at it, what we recently launched was Android apps running on Chrome. So you can take a Chromebook and have the Google Play Store on this device, and it will run Android applications. So one of the kind of challenges or barriers to adoption, if you like, of Chrome historically had been that I need application X, Y, Z. It's not available on the platform, and therefore I can't move to a kind of full Chromebook environment. Now, hopefully, you can. You get the full set of Play apps. It's not a sort of emulator. There's no need to customize the application, and you still get all of the benefits around application management and the store management that we talked about. Okay, so a couple of pieces on deployment. So this is one thing that I think often gets kind of overlooked, and what I said before about looking at our strategy, I think often it's easy to go into it saying, let's look at our IT strategy. The answer is we need to deploy an MDM and lock down all of these devices, but let's look at our strategy. And I think, yes, there may be regulatory requirements, data loss protection, security, whatever it may be, but I think it's kind of important to bear in mind what they are, and again, maybe document and work through these, because the most important thing, as we see, really is where, how that affects the user of this technology. There's a session actually tomorrow, I think it's in here at 11:20, which talks about how we as Google do this internally, which I'd highly recommend you come to, and some of our approaches around things like tiered access that they'll go into, providing increasing levels of access with increasing levels of security, for example, that kind of thing. Because when it comes to a user, I think it's again, it often kind of overlooked, and we hear a lot from users of having to jump through lots of hurdles, having their 16-digit alphanumeric passcode and so on, and all they can do now is get email, and is this a benefit to me as a user? Am I sure I want to go through this? And so it's key to kind of articulate what it is that they get from it. And so we've seen some partners come up with quite innovative solutions around that. So I mentioned this kind of tiered access approach, or really kind of letting users have access to some data, and only really increasing the level of enforcement and management when they go to access something that's deemed more secure. You don't need to have two-factor authentication and these kind of really long passcodes to get email, but maybe you do if you're going to be VPNing back into the office, for example. So another few things. So the MDM, EMM, MAM kind of plays a little bit into that sort of tiered access approach of stepping up through the sort of security levels. Select a partner or build your own. So this is an increasing kind of trend that we see from in a number of different areas of companies saying, well, actually, I'm building my own applications internally, and I only need sort of lightweight management or whatever. And building at least a portion of that themselves. So that's something that, again, we have a bunch of tools and resources to help you go through that should you want to. Migrating EMM and device OS is another kind of common thread that we get, is around this kind of companies moving either between EMM, having multi-EMM. It used to be something that was somewhat challenging. We've hopefully made a lot easier. And also migrating OS, and again, there's, as I mentioned, there's a lot of sort of rugged devices and so on out there that are moving from maybe a Windows CE world into the Android world, and again, there's a bunch of partners out there who can help with this kind of migration story. User training and support, again, is kind of straightforward, basic, often forgotten, and yes, there are such things as other platforms, not just Android and Chrome. And obviously, in a number of the kind of G Suite and other sessions, you'll see how we can support those. So a few examples. Dan mentioned Home Depot in her keynote this morning, which hopefully you all caught. This is actually a different customer that we've been working with, based out of the UK, but a kind of multinational supermarket brand, and they were doing exactly this, kind of replacing legacy Windows devices, consolidating down from sort of the drivers with a tool belt full of one device to do the barcode scanning, one device to do the navigation, one device to do the signing off and drop off and that kind of thing, down into a single device. Customer-facing and employee-facing tablets in their warehouses and in their stores, a whole different kind of slew of use cases, and they were dealing with multi-MM and had this very much, as they call it, white glove deployment for their kind of head office devices. So, they're a kind of a great example of where we can go through all those tools and all those funny shaped devices in one of the earlier slides and say, well, actually, we can pick a solution for each of these. We've got a different management mode for each of these kind of use cases. And by kind of stepping through that, we can cover all of the kind of use cases that they've got. Another example of where we've had sort of partnership success, as well as the sort of customer success is Zebra, or Zebra, as I should say, name over here. So they're a, if you don't know, rugged device manufacturer with the sort of symbol heritage. So real sort of background in warehouse and other kind of use cases. And when I first started speaking to these guys, they were very much sort of against adopting Google technology on their platform, and it was seen as too kind of challenging and too much of a kind of really a hard sell, if you like, to their customers. But what we were able to work through these steps that we talked about earlier, from L to M and into N, was that because you're able to take this device which has the Android and GMS on, you're able to manage it with this consistent framework. You're able to guarantee security, deploy apps, and so on through Google Play. It actually became a real kind of strength and a benefit to them, and they have really kind of gone all in on Android and on GMS. So they have professional services teams do migration. They've signed up to our security patches, again, which you may have heard of in some of the other sessions. So we release security patches every 30 days, and OEMs take those on board, and Zebra have been quick to adopt that and commit to do that over a long period. So for the 3 years or 5 years that a device is sold for, and 3 or 5 years beyond that. So they've really been a kind of good example of where we've gone from not really fitting in that kind of area and that use case before, to through adopting fully our sort of enterprise feature set. So I'm just going to run through a few resources to help you guys, hopefully. So one of the more recent innovations that we've delivered is the Android management experience. So what we were seeing was that it was quite challenging for companies to just sort of take a quick look, try and experience a work profile and the sort of application deployment and so on a device. So we created something called the Android management experience. If you search for this in Google Play on a device, you'll be able to download it, set up with a sort of couple of clicks, set up a sort of demo company environment, and go through and sort of practice with deploying applications and policy and so on. So a super quick way in just a couple of minutes to get up and running and experience it, and show colleagues or whatever, and then you can kind of step through into fully managed wider deployment. Enterprise.google.com/Android has a whole bunch of information around partner directory, various solutions, has our blog where we publish a whole load of very useful information and links to resources way beyond. Similarly, enterprise.google.com/Chrome, again, another great resource for essentially this similar kind of set of product solutions and partners, etc. A couple of quick call-outs. So there's an Android and Chrome sandbox over in Moscone on the 3rd floor. If you haven't seen it, it looks like a sort of garden shed with some brightly coloured tools. I kid you not. So please go over there, take a look. Myself or some of my colleagues will be over there to kind of take you through some of the solutions we've got over there. And if you're a developer, then as well as we have Google Dev Hub, you search for that online and it should be the first thing you find. And my colleague Matt Goodridge is presenting in this room tomorrow, I think at 4 o'clock, on application deployment and so on, and managed Google Play.